September 4th, 1552. Eger is not facing an army, it's facing a timetable. 38 days. That's how long the siege will last. And every one of those days has a price. Gunpowder burned, walls rebuilt, wounds infected, bread divided thinner until it becomes a rumor. This is what empires sell at the edge of the map. Not conquest, but surrender on schedule. So here's the big question. When the Ottoman state turns siege into a repeatable procedure, what is it actually buying? A fortress? Or the human reflex to give up before winter and hunger do the killing? Viewer discretion advised. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Eger stands in a country already taught what inevitable means. After Mohacs, after Buda, Hungary isn't one thing anymore. It's a torn borderland. Ottoman power pressing from the south, Habsburg authority tugging from the west, and a fragile strip of contested ground in between where every village knows the same question. When the next column comes, do we run, do we kneel, or do we become a warning? That summer, the warning system worked exactly as designed. Fortresses fell in the Ottoman 1552 campaign, one after another, not as random tragedies, but as demonstrations. Temesvar fell in July. Szolnok fell on the very day Eger's siege begins. Like a stamped notice slipped under a door. You are next. And the point of those falls is not just territory, it's psychology. Empires don't need to destroy everyone. They need enough people to believe resistance is irrational. The rest will do the conquering for them, by surrendering early. Inside Eger, heroism looks less like speeches and more like inventory. How much powder do we have? How many shot? How much grain? How long until the bread becomes mold and then becomes nothing? How many hands can still carry rubble after a night with no sleep? Every siege is a math problem that eats human beings to balance itself. The procedure is simple. Isolate the target, exhaust the defenders, breach the walls, then let the survivors explain to the next town why obedience is cheaper. Istvan Dobo, the castle's commander, is not a myth at this point. He is a man trapped inside a decision. If he retreats, the frontier retreats. If he surrenders, the cost doesn't disappear. It changes ownership. Because surrender is not peace. It's a transfer of control over bodies, property, and memory, written in the language of terms. A fortress can be taken by cannon, but submission is taken by fear. Fear of what happens after the gates open. And the Ottoman army outside does not arrive as a chaotic horde. It arrives like administration with teeth. Engineers, artillery, disciplined ranks, supply trains, winter calculations. A system that has done this before. A system built to make refusal feel childish. So Eger becomes more than a place. It becomes an argument. Not about courage. About whether a state can manufacture surrender as reliably as it manufactures cannonballs. And what happens when 2,000 people refuse to cooperate with the timetable? Hungary doesn't enter 1552 as a proud kingdom looking for a glorious fight. It enters as a state already in pieces. Like a crime scene that has been legally closed without ever being solved. People love to tell this era as a clash of civilizations, as if it's faith versus faith, crescent versus cross. That story is comforting because it turns suffering into symbolism. But the frontier doesn't care about symbolism. The frontier cares about who controls roads, rivers, grain, and the ability to move an army before the weather turns. Start with the hard rupture. 1526, Mohács. Hungary's field army is crushed, and King Louis II dies during the retreat. A kingdom doesn't just lose a battle there, it loses coherence. When the central authority collapses, the map becomes negotiable. And empires are very good negotiators when their arguments are canon and time. Then comes the second cut, 1541, Buda. The capital is taken, and the country doesn't simply fall. And it splits into a three-part reality that makes everyone complicit. Ottoman-controlled territories in the south. Habsburg-controlled lands in the west and north. And between them, a contested strip, borderland Hungary, where every town becomes both hostage and shield. That middle zone is where Eger lives, not in legend, in policy, in the space where both sides want you alive long enough to be useful, and afraid long enough to be obedient. This is what makes frontier politics so obscene. Your choices are always framed as morality, stand or surrender, brave or coward. But the real mechanism is logistics. A frontier fortress is not primarily a romantic symbol. It's a technology for buying time, cheaper than raising a field army, cheaper than trying to hold open terrain against a power that can concentrate force. A fortress delays. A fortress bleeds the attacker. A fortress forces the empire to spend powder, food, manpower, and weeks of campaign season. And those weeks matter because Central Europe has a brutal truth. Winter isn't scenery. It's an enemy that doesn't negotiate. So the border fortresses become the Habsburg and Hungarian coping strategy. Build walls, reinforce gates, pray for money that arrives late, hope the next commander is competent, and tell the civilians it's safer behind stone than out in the open. The lie isn't malicious, it's necessary. Because where else do you put thousands of people when villages burn and cavalry raids turn a harvest into ash? By 1552, the Ottoman state under Suleiman has been expanding for decades with a rhythm that feels unstoppable to those watching it from the wrong side of the Danube. Belgrade falls in 1521. Rhodes falls in 1522. Vienna is threatened in 1529. And through this period, the lesson is consistent. The empire doesn't rely on miracles. It relies on systems, campaign planning, disciplined troops, artillery expertise, engineers, and the ability to feed large forces far from home. The reason that scares Europe isn't that the Ottomans are barbaric. It's that they are organized. Barbarism is chaotic. Organization is repeatable. And in 1552, repeatability is the point. That year's Ottoman campaign in Hungary takes fortresses in sequence. Temesvar falls in July. Szolnok falls in early September. These are not isolated events. They are stepping stones. Every fortress taken collapses the distance to the next one. Every captured supply point makes the next operation easier. War, at this level, is not rage, it's rooting. Now look at Eger through that lens. It sits in northern Hungary, on the frontier line that still exists precisely because other lines have already failed. It is not the last fortress before all of Europe, but it is a serious lock in the northern system. a strong point whose survival complicates Ottoman movement, and whose fall opens routes toward the interior. More importantly, it carries psychological weight. It tells the surrounding towns whether resistance is still an option, or whether the only rational act left is to preempt the suffering by submitting early. Inside Eger are roughly 2,000 defenders and civilians under István Dobó. That number matters not because it's inspiring, but because it defines what kind of war this will be. 2,000 means every casualty is strategic. Every day of bombardment is a medical crisis. Every burned roof is a winter problem, even if the battle ends before snow. 2,000 means the defenders are not a garrison. They are a trapped society being asked to function under impact. And outside, the Ottoman commanders do not need to hate you to destroy you. They only need to apply the method that has worked elsewhere. Isolate, bombard, mine, assault. The terrifying part is how little emotion that requires. When violence becomes procedure, cruelty becomes optional. The system does the work. Eger is about to learn what that feels like, not as a story, but as a schedule. And the first thing you will hear before the first ladder hits stone is not a battle cry. It's the beginning of an operation. If you want to understand why Eger matters, you have to stop imagining the Ottoman army as an emotion and start recognizing it as a system. Horde is what people say when they need a moral shortcut, when they want to believe the violence they're about to describe is irrational. But the Ottoman state in the mid-16th century is rational in the way only large institutions can be. It has a doctrine, a division of labor, and a memory. It has done this before. It has learned what works. And it has learned that the cheapest victory is the one where the defenders surrender early, before the empire has to spend its most expensive resources, time and elite manpower. A siege is not just force. It is administration performed at sword point. The first act is isolation. You don't begin by breaking a wall. You begin by breaking a schedule. Roads close. Messengers disappear. The town becomes a sealed container. In that container, hunger and rumor spread faster than disease. This is not incidental. It is the point. Because once the defenders understand they are alone, they start bargaining with reality. The longer they wait, the worse their terms get. A siege is a negotiation where the only language is delay. Then comes the second act, bombardment. Artillery in this era is not a magical wall-deleting beam. It is heavy, temperamental, expensive. It requires powder, shot, teams of animals, carpenters, drivers, gunners, and an entire supply chain just to keep it firing day after day. That is exactly why it works as psychology. A steady rhythm of impact says something deeper than destruction. It says the attacker can afford to keep going longer than you can. The wall might hold. Your nerves might not. Your sleep won't. Your wounded will rot. Your repair crews will turn into ghosts that work at night and bleed by morning. And while the cannon speaks loudest, the quieter work begins underneath. Mining is the most intimate form of siege warfare, an argument made in darkness with hands and timber and earth. It is not heroic, it is terrifying. The logic is simple. Walls are strong when they stand on something solid. Remove the ground beneath a section, and the wall becomes its own executioner. The defenders do not see the mine. That's what makes it so effective. They only hear it, if they're lucky. And hearing is not guaranteed when you have lived for weeks inside thunder. Finally comes the assault. Ladders, breaches, the press of bodies into narrow spaces where bravery becomes irrelevant and survival becomes a shove. This is where stories often go to die in cliches. Wave after wave, relentless. But the real horror is procedural. Assault is not madness. It is the final step of a workflow. It happens when the defenders are tired, when their powder is lower, when their walls have been softened, when their minds have been conditioned to expect impact and therefore can no longer think clearly under silence. It's not the first punch. It's the punch you throw when the other person can't keep their hands up. This is why the Ottoman method terrifies Central Europe. It is repeatable. It is not dependent on one genius commander or one lucky day. It is designed to function even when individuals fail. That is the mark of empire. Personal cruelty is optional. The machine is not. In 1552, the machine is run by experienced leadership. Kara Ahmed Pasha is a central figure in the campaign, and forces from Ottoman-held Buda under Hatem Ali Pasha also take part in the push through Hungary's fortress chain. You can argue over exact headcounts in any single camp on any single day. Chroniclers always do, but you cannot argue with the campaign's sequence. Temesvar falls. Szolnok falls. Eger is then encircled. This is how empires advance, not in one dramatic lunge, but in steps that turn yesterday's frontier into today's staging ground. And here's the moral complication the heroic version avoids. Ottoman siege practice often includes an offer. Surrender early, and you may receive terms, safe passage, sparing, a managed transition of power. Resist too long, and the terms change into an example. This is not mercy, it is pricing. A city that surrenders cheaply teaches the next city to do the same. A city that resists expensively teaches the next city that obedience is the only rational choice. Either way, the outcome is psychological conquest. The wall is just the delivery system. So, when people ask, why didn't they just surrender? They're really asking a darker question. Why didn't they accept the logic that empires teach? Why didn't they choose the path that minimizes suffering? Because sometimes the promise of minimized suffering is itself a weapon. Because surrender is not just a military decision. It is a transfer of ownership over bodies, homes, churches, harvests, and the future right to remember your life as something other than a footnote in someone else's ledger. Eger is about to receive that offer, not as a dramatic duel between noble men, as paperwork with a flag of truce delivered at the gate to a society already running out of breath. And once the offer is refused, the method begins in full, not as rage, but as routine. The question is not whether the Ottomans can break stone. The question is whether they can break the human instinct to keep breathing under impossible arithmetic. And the next sound you hear will be the empire's answer, measured in the first day's impacts. By the time the Ottoman campaign reaches Eger, the most important weapon inside the walls isn't courage. It's preparation that looks boring on purpose, because a siege doesn't reward the dramatic. It rewards the mechanical. It rewards the people who can keep working while their ears ring, while their hands shake, while their stomachs are empty, while the day-night cycle dissolves into one continuous noise. Istvan Dobo has been in command at Eger for years by this point. That matters. Not because it makes him a legend, but because it gives him something empires usually count on defenders not having: time to think like an accountant. He understands what artillery does to medieval stone when stone is left alone. So he doesn't leave stone alone. He makes it heavier without making it prettier. He reinforces, thickens, piles earth where earth can absorb what masonry cannot. Earth doesn't shatter the way stone does. Earth eats energy. It turns impact into vibration instead of collapse. That is not romance. That is physics, weaponized for survival. And that is the first confrontation you need to hold in your mind. The Ottoman method is procedure, but so is defense when it's done by someone competent. Two systems are about to collide. One designed to break walls, one designed to deny the satisfaction of a clean breach. Inside Eger, everything becomes inventory. Grain is counted. Powder is guarded like blood. Water is planned, not assumed. Tools become strategic assets: shovels, picks, timber, nails. Because when the wall cracks, you don't fix it with faith. You fix it with hands and material. A fortress survives artillery by treating itself like a construction site that never closes. The battlefield is the repair schedule. And then there are the people. Stories like to separate soldiers from civilians as if war respects categories. Sieges don't. A siege turns everyone into labor because labor is what keeps you alive. The garrison may be the spine, but the town is the muscle. Someone hauls rubble. Someone carries water. Someone moves powder under fire without letting fear turn their fingers stupid. Someone stands watch for hours, not because they're brave, but because if they don't, the mine reaches the foundation before anyone notices. This is where the moral cost shows itself. A fortress is marketed as protection, but once the gates close, it also becomes confinement. You don't have the option to opt out of the siege. The walls that keep the enemy out also keep you in with your own dwindling supplies, your own wounded, your own panic. Safety becomes a contract. The payment is obedience to necessity. You ration because hunger is a discipline tool. You assign tasks because chaos kills faster than cannon. You enforce order not as virtue, but as a survival technology. That's the paradox of defensive freedom on a frontier. Eger is fighting an empire that tries to manufacture surrender through pressure. But to resist that pressure, Eger must manufacture its own kind of discipline, its own internal coercion. The town becomes a state in miniature, not in ideology, in function, a chain of command, a distribution system, a rule set, a way of turning frightened bodies into coordinated output. Even the calendar becomes a weapon. Because the Ottomans are not just attacking with steel, they're attacking with season. The defenders know what's coming. Autumn rains, colder nights, the first hints of winter that turn supply lines into mud and men into fever. The attacker wants to use that knowledge to accelerate surrender. The defender wants to endure long enough that the attacker's campaign math turns ugly. This is not a duel of honor. It's a race between two forms of exhaustion. The cruelest part is that both sides understand it. The Ottoman commanders are not ignorant of logistics. They are logistics. Feeding thousands of men, moving heavy guns, maintaining powder, keeping discipline, these are not side details. They are the empire's bloodstream. A siege that drags is expensive, even for a great power, because it consumes the one thing no army can replenish on demand: usable days. The defenders may not know every detail of the enemy's stockpiles, but they do know this: the longer they hold, the more the empire must pay for the privilege of killing them. So Dobo's preparation is not just about walls. It's about denying the attacker a quick narrative, because quick victories become propaganda. They become the reason the next town surrenders before the first shot. But a stubborn fortress forces the empire into a slower story, a story with questions attached. Why is it taking so long? How many men are being spent? How many weeks are being burned for a place that was supposed to be a formality? That is the strategic value of endurance, not that it's noble, that it's disruptive. And now the system arrives to test that disruption. The Ottoman campaign has already demonstrated its rhythm elsewhere. Eger has watched the chain of falls tighten the noose. The defenders have heard the rumors the way towns always do, not as clean facts, but as dread carried by refugees and patrols and smoke on the horizon. They know what surrender can mean and what resistance can trigger, not in poetry, but in consequences. Then comes the moment every siege shares, the moment where it stops being preparation and becomes commitment. A flag of truce, an envoy at the gate, a formal offer that makes violence sound administrative. Surrender now and terms may exist. Refuse and terms will be replaced by procedure. This is where Eger's story becomes unavoidable, because Dobo's answer isn't just a military choice. It's a decision about what kind of frontier Hungary will be allowed to imagine itself as, an accounting error to be corrected, or a place that can still say no, even when the timetable has already been written. The envoy waits, the fortress breathes, and the Ottoman method is poised to begin the moment the answer is spoken. The first thing people get wrong about cannon fire is that it's only about razrashenie, destruction. In a siege, destruction is almost secondary. The main product is mental collapse. Artillery is how an empire reaches into a fortress and rearranges the defender's sense of time, safety, and control until surrender starts to feel like relief instead of betrayal. When the Ottoman guns open, the impact isn't cinematic. It's administrative. It arrives in a rhythm, a schedule, a repetition so steady that it teaches your nervous system a new language. Wait, brace, inhale, flinch, rebuild, repeat. Sleep becomes impossible, not because the wall falls, but because your body never gets permission to stop listening. Dust settles into lungs. The air tastes like stone. Every conversation becomes a shouted negotiation over noise. Eger's defenders quickly discover the deeper problem. You can't win against cannon by courage alone. You win, if you can call it winning, by labor. Every hit creates a task. Every crack becomes an order. Repair crews move like insects at night, shoring up masonry with timber and rubble, packing earth into gaps, widening the parts of the wall that can be widened, improvising where improvisation is allowed. The earthworks Dobo had prepared matter now in the most unromantic way possible. They absorb energy. They keep damage localized. They prevent the kind of clean, dramatic breach that makes assault simple. But even when the walls hold, the bombardment still does its work. It turns the fortress into a place where everyone is slightly less human each day. Hunger sharpens. Tempers shorten. Fear turns into numbness. And numbness turns into mistakes. In a siege, mistakes kill more reliably than heroism saves. Drop a powder barrel. Misread an order. Leave a gap unpatched for one night. Fail to hear the difference between a cannon impact and a mining vibration. The system punishes weakness without needing to hate you. That's why siege doctrine pairs bombardment with isolation. Because isolation ensures that as the days pass, the defenders do not receive relief, only more reasons to doubt. No fresh food, no extra powder, no authoritative news, only rumor. And rumor is a weapon because it lets the mind do the attacker's work. Help is coming. Help isn't coming. They've taken the next fortress. They're already inside the outer works. In a sealed place, information behaves like infection. Outside, the Ottoman side is paying too, but paying from a different pocket. Every day of firing is powder expended. Every stone shot hauled is labor. Every ox and cart and driver is part of the siege's appetite. A siege train is not just artillery, it's an ecosystem that must be fed. That's the reality the romantic versions avoid. The attacker's greatest advantage, scale, also creates vulnerability. Thousands of men consume astonishing amounts of food and fodder. Campaigning in Hungary is not a march through friendly farms. It's movement through contested land where supply lines stretch, where roads become mud, where a single disruption can ripple into hunger in the camp. This is why the Ottoman method is so ruthless about time. The empire wants to break Eger fast, not because it can't fight longer, but because every extra week changes the cost-benefit calculation. Winter is the auditor that doesn't take bribes. Once the season turns, the same roads that brought powder and bread become traps. A commander who looks strong in September can look foolish in October. A siege that felt inevitable can start to feel like a waste. Dobo's job then is not to defeat artillery. It is to make artillery insufficient, to turn the empire's signature tool into a slow bleed that drains campaign time and raises political questions in the Ottoman camp. Why is this taking so long? Why are we spending elite troops and powder on a place that was supposed to be routine? The defenders may not know the details of Ottoman dispatches, but they understand something fundamental. Empires are powerful, but they are also bureaucratic. They need results. They need narratives. They need victories. They can report upward without embarrassment. And in a siege, embarrassment is not a feeling. It's a strategic condition. Because commanders are judged not only by outcomes, but by efficiency. A prolonged siege is a public admission that the method is meeting resistance. That admission is dangerous because it gives hope to other fortresses, other towns, other border commanders who have been living under the illusion that surrender is the only rational option. So the bombardment continues, day after day, and Eger continues to absorb it, repairing, patching, enduring, trying to keep the mind intact long enough for the calendar to become their ally. The defenders do not need the wall to be perfect. They need it to be not yet broken. They are not aiming for victory. They are aiming to postpone the moment the empire can convert pressure into entry. Eventually, the Ottomans adjust. Because bombardment alone is a persuasion tactic, and persuasion fails if the target refuses to be persuaded. A wall can be battered for weeks and still stand if it is reinforced, if the defenders are disciplined, if repair outpaces damage. When that happens, the method shifts to its next phase, direct assault, timed to exploit fatigue. And that's when the siege stops being a thunderstorm and becomes a hand reaching over the parapet. The drums begin, the columns form, and Eger learns the difference between enduring impact and enduring proximity. A bombardment is impersonal. You can endure it by becoming a function. Repair, ration, breathe, repeat. An assault is different. An assault is the empire trying to climb into your lungs. When the Ottoman attack finally comes in force, it doesn't arrive with mystery. It arrives with rhythm, drums, movement, the mechanical certainty of ladders being carried forward by men who have done this at other walls. This is why the method works. It doesn't ask the attacker to improvise courage. It asks them to execute a task. Close the distance. Hook the ladder. Climb. Make the defenders spend themselves. From the top of Eger's walls, the defenders see the shape of the problem immediately. On paper, an assault is a moment. In reality, it is a contest of replacement. If the attackers can keep placing bodies at the base of the ladders, the defenders will eventually run out of arms to push them back. And if a foothold is established, if enough men crest the parapet at once, then the wall stops being a barrier and becomes a narrow corridor where numbers turn into pressure. So Dobo does the one thing siege defense always demands. The thing that looks cruel when you say it out loud. He waits. He does not waste powder at distance. He forces the attackers to walk into the most expensive meters of ground. Because the defenders don't have the Empire's reserves. They can't afford to fire at shadows. They need the enemy close enough that every shot matters. When the Ottoman columns reach that killing distance, the wall answers. Matchlocks crack, cannons spit, anti-personnel shot, and the first ranks collapse in the way massed bodies collapse when physics finally catches up with belief. For a moment, you can almost understand why people later tell stories about miracles. It looks like it should be impossible for a small garrison to do that much damage. But the miracle is not divine. It's geometry. Narrow approach routes. Limited ladder positions. The simple fact that only so many men can climb a ladder at once, and only so many men can fit at the top of a parapet without falling. The defenders are not defeating the Empire. They are forcing the Empire to fight inside a funnel. And the Empire's answer is just as mechanical. Replace the fallen. Keep climbing. Use discipline as a weapon. An organized assault does not stop because the first wave dies. It is designed with that expectation. The goal is not a clean victory. It is to turn the defender's success into exhaustion. This is where siege warfare becomes intimate, in a way battlefield war rarely is. A man reaches the top of a ladder and must haul himself over stone while hands on the wall are trying to unmake his fingers. Spears thrust into faces. Axes bite into wrists. Men shove ladders backward, not because they are strong, but because they cannot allow one more climber to arrive. There is no room for grand tactics here, only the brutal arithmetic of grip and gravity. And this is also where the uncomfortable truth about civilians becomes unavoidable. The longer a siege lasts, the less meaningful that word becomes. In the Ottoman method, assault is paired with attrition. Attrition doesn't care whether your hands belong to a soldier. If Eger is to survive, every able body becomes part of the defense system, not as a romantic slogan, but because the fortress has to keep functioning while it is being attacked. So, civilians haul ammunition and water. They carry stones and timber to repair damage while the assault still echoes. They drag the wounded away from the wall because leaving bodies in place is a tactical error. And some of them perform the darkest work of siege defense, using what the fortress has in abundance when powder is finite. Boiling liquids, water, rendered fat, oil, poured downward to break ladders and bodies at the base. This is not an exotic tactic. It is common in siege warfare for the simplest reason. Gravity is free, and heat can compensate for the lack of steel. If you want to tell a heroic story, you describe it as courage. If you want to tell the truth, you describe it as necessity. A siege forces people to weaponize their household. Cooking becomes killing. The same cauldron that fed a family becomes a tool to blind a stranger. The same hands that kneaded dough yesterday now carry scalding weight to a parapet under arrows. The moral distance collapses as fast as the physical one. Nobody inside a besieged wall stays clean. The assault drags on for hours, and when it finally breaks, when the attackers pull back to regroup, the scene is not victory. It's damage assessment. How many are dead? How many are wounded? How much powder was spent? How many ladders were pushed back successfully? And how many sections of wall were weakened in the process? The defenders count bodies the way accountants count coins, because the body count is their currency now. And this is the second thing stories get wrong. Repelling an assault can still be catastrophic for a small garrison. The Ottomans can afford to lose hundreds and return tomorrow. Eger cannot. Every killed defender is a missing hand on the wall, a missing pick in the repair crew, a missing pair of eyes listening for mines. Every wounded man is a mouth that still needs food and water but cannot fight. The siege is not only an attack on stone, it is an attack on capacity. Dobo understands what the first major assault has revealed. The walls can hold. The method can be disrupted. But if the Empire keeps repeating the same step, assault after assault, Eger will be ground down simply because it is smaller. So the Ottoman commanders do what the method prescribes when the surface won't yield fast enough. They stop trying to climb over resistance. They start trying to go beneath it, because the next phase of the siege doesn't announce itself with drums. It announces itself with silence, and a faint vibration under the stone that only the most exhausted ears will still be able to notice. Mining is the part of siege warfare nobody wants to imagine, because it turns the fortress into a living thing. With a heartbeat, you can hear failing. Bombardment attacks what you can see. Assault attacks what you can touch. Mining attacks what you trust without thinking. The ground. The logic is brutal and simple. Stone walls can carry enormous weight as long as their foundations remain intact. But remove the earth beneath a section, and the wall doesn't need to be smashed. It collapses under its own mass. That's what makes mining so terrifying. The defenders can fight a ladder. They can patch a crack. They can even endure thunder. But how do you fight an enemy you can't see, working in darkness, turning the ground into an invisible weapon? The Ottoman side understands this fear. That's why mining is not just engineering. It is psychology with tools. The miners don't need to breach the entire fortress. They need to make the defenders believe the fortress is no longer a stable place to stand. Once that belief sets in, discipline begins to rot. Men start mishearing sounds. They start panicking at nothing. They start running to check places that don't matter, while the real mine keeps crawling forward. Inside Eger, the response is not heroic, it is obsessive, because countermine work has to be done by people who are already tired, already hungry, already hearing ghosts in every impact. The defenders place watchers where the ground is most likely to betray them. They listen. They try to separate true vibrations from the background noise of a siege that never fully stops. And they use crude detection methods that feel almost insulting compared to the Empire's artillery. Bowls of water placed on the ground, eyes trained to notice ripples. In a world of bronze cannon and disciplined ranks, the early warning system can be something as small as a trembling surface catching candlelight. This is where the siege becomes an argument about knowledge. The Ottomans bring specialists, engineers and sappers trained for this work. The defenders respond by turning ordinary attention into a skill. The men watching those bowls aren't doing nothing. They are fighting a battle of perception, trying to prove the ground still belongs to the living. When the ripples come, when the sound of digging becomes real, Dobo cannot afford hesitation. If he waits too long, the mine reaches the foundation and the wall becomes a trap. So he orders countermine teams to dig. Not a grand tunnel, not a comfortable passage, but a narrow wound in the earth, just wide enough for a man to crawl, reinforced with timber because the ground is eager to collapse and bury you alive, even without the enemy's help. And once you go down there, the fortress changes you. Air becomes a resource. Light becomes a gamble. Every oil lamp is a gift and a threat, because it lets you see, but it also eats oxygen. Every breath feels owned by the tunnel. Men work with picks and shovels in spaces that punish movement. Their bodies learn a new fear, not of dying quickly, but of dying slowly, crushed, suffocated, and forgotten under the same walls they were trying to protect. The most horrifying part is that countermine warfare doesn't allow distance. Up on the wall, you can pretend you are fighting an army. Down here, you are fighting a few men in the dark. You hear them before you see them. Sometimes you don't see them at all. When the tunnels meet, there is no room for the kind of violence people imagine in stories. There's no sweeping sword strike, no charge, just close hands, short blades, picks used like butcher tools, bodies pressing in spaces too tight to turn around. You don't fight for glory, you fight for inches of air. And because you can't maneuver, you can't win cleanly. You either drive the enemy back, collapse their passage, or you die in place and become part of the tunnel's structure. If you want to understand what sieges do to the mind, don't look at speeches on the ramparts. Look here. Because underground combat is not just danger, it is intimacy with death. Men come out shaking, covered in earth, eyes unfocused, moving like they left part of themselves down there. They are alive, but they are not intact. And Eger does not have the luxury of rest. The tunnel war is labor that must be repeated until the attacker gives up or the wall gives way. For the Ottoman engineers, mining is also costly. It takes time. It takes skilled men. It takes protection, because miners are vulnerable to sudden sorties and to countermine attacks. And it requires confidence that your mine will not be discovered too early. That is why mining is paired with continued bombardment. Noise on the surface becomes camouflage for the work below. The Empire tries to drown the defenders in sound so that the real threat can move in silence. Eger answers with the only counter it has: relentless attention. Watchers rotate even when their eyes burn. Teams dig even when their hands blister and split. Civilians who cannot fight on the wall still carry timber, haul rubble, and keep the underground crews supplied. Because a siege doesn't separate frontline from support. It turns the entire trapped society into a machine, competing with the Empire's machine. But this is where the arithmetic tightens. Every countermine team is pulled from some other job. Every man underground is one less man repairing the wall, one less musket at the parapet, one less body to carry water to the wounded. Eger can neutralize a mine and still lose the siege, simply because the work of stopping the wall from collapsing accelerates the collapse of the people. By late September, the defenders have proven they can hear the Empire under their feet. They have proven they can disrupt the method even in the dark. But the method adapts. The Ottomans don't need one successful mine. They can try again, and again, and again, until exhaustion does what artillery and ladders could not. Eger has entered the phase where the enemy is no longer just outside the walls. The enemy is inside the ground, inside the sleep-deprived mind, inside the daily realization that holding is possible, but holding is also killing the holders. And that is the turn that matters. If the wall can be kept standing, the question becomes whether the people behind it can remain functional long enough for time to punish the Empire instead of them. Because now Eger's greatest threat is no longer a breach, it's depletion. There is a version of siege warfare that lives in paintings. Flags on walls, ladders in smoke, heroic silhouettes framed by fire. That version is useful. It recruits belief, but it hides the actual killing. In a real siege, the largest weapon is not a cannon. It is attrition. Attrition is what happens when a society is sealed and forced to consume itself from the inside until surrender feels like medicine. By the time Eger has survived bombardments, assaults, and the first round of underground war, the fortress is still standing, but the people are already shrinking. Not physically at first, functionally. Every day removes a little capability. One man too wounded to lift a musket, one woman too burned to carry water, one child too exhausted to run errands, one old healer overwhelmed by infections that don't care about prayers. The wall doesn't have to fall to make the defense fail. The defense can fail because the bodies behind the wall stop working. This is why the Ottoman method is designed the way it is. It doesn't rely on a single catastrophic moment. It relies on a predictable erosion of capacity. Isolation denies replacement. Bombardment denies sleep. Assault denies safety. mining denies trust in the ground, and all of it, together, denies the defenders the most precious resource in a siege: margin. The space between we are functioning and we are collapsing. Inside Eger, rationing becomes law. Not metaphorically, literally. Someone decides how much bread each person receives, and that decision becomes a form of governance more immediate than any distant king. Hunger is not just discomfort. Hunger is a tool that rewrites morality. You begin to resent the wounded because they still need food. You begin to count children not as children, but as mouths. You begin to understand why empires love sieges. They outsource cruelty to scarcity. They don't have to corrupt you directly. They just have to close the roads. And as rations tighten, the fortress also becomes medically primitive in the worst way. Wounds that would be survivable in peace become death sentences because infection is an opportunist. Burns from boiling defense measures, cuts from shrapnel and stone, fractures from falling masonry. These are not dramatic in a narrative sense, but they accumulate. Without antibiotics, without reliable anesthesia, without sterile tools, the hospital is often just a room where pain is managed by endurance and where death arrives as fever. This is where the moral cost of defense becomes unavoidable. The defenders are not only fighting an empire, they are managing suffering at industrial scale with medieval tools. When people later call Eger a miracle, they're talking about the wall. The real miracle, if you insist on the word, is that the social fabric doesn't rip completely under the weight of hunger, fear, awe, and exhaustion. Because exhaustion is the quiet executioner of sieges. An assault can kill a man in seconds. Exhaustion kills judgment for weeks. It makes sentries doze. It makes repair crews misplace supports. It makes commanders misread signs. It makes people start whispering the most dangerous sentence a besieged society can say: "This can't be worth it." And notice how that sentence is never purely rational. It is physiological. It is spoken by a body that has run out of glycogen, by a mind that has been deprived of sleep, by hands that have shaken too long under impact. This is why siege warfare is a technology of obedience. It aims not to convince your ideals, but to crush your nervous system until your ideals can't stand up. Dobo understands this, which is why his management isn't just tactical. It is psychological containment. He has to keep the fortress believing in itself while the fortress is starving. He has to prevent panic from spreading faster than hunger. That means routine. Work assignments, night watches, repair schedules. The kind of boring order that feels almost insulting in the face of death, but is actually the only thing that keeps people from dissolving into chaos. And the civilians, again, the word becomes absurd, are not helpers at this stage. They are structural supports. They carry rubble to patch craters. They move water to fire teams. They tend the wounded until their hands are raw and their eyes no longer recognize peace. They become part of the fortress's metabolism. If they stop, the fortress stops. But the Ottoman side is also paying. The siege has dragged into the season when the empire's own timetable becomes dangerous. A prolonged operation consumes powder and food in enormous quantities. Feeding thousands of men in the field is not an abstract logistical achievement. It is a daily crisis solved by wagons arriving on time. And wagons do not love autumn rain. Roads turn to mud. Animals tire. Fodder runs out. Disease spreads in camps too. The difference is that the Ottoman army can move away from its sick. Eger cannot. That's why the mid-siege phase is where pressure builds on commanders. Every day without victory is not just time wasted, it is reputation at risk. A campaign is a promise made upward. A commander in the field is always writing an invisible report to the center. This is under control. A long siege forces a different report. This is harder than expected. And that report is poison in a hierarchy built on certainty. So the procedure escalates. If the wall resists, if mines are neutralized, if assaults bleed men without producing entry, the method demands a larger commitment, not because the Ottomans are irrational, but because they must either finish the operation or admit the operation is failing. And in imperial politics, failure isn't only a military fact, it is a contagious narrative. Inside Eger, the defenders begin to sense this shift before they understand it. Bombardments intensify. Assault preparations become more visible. The pattern changes. The enemy is no longer testing. The enemy is preparing to spend more. And this is where the siege becomes most terrifying for the people inside, because they can feel the last margins closing. Powder stocks decline, food shrinks. The wounded multiply. The walls carry scars that cannot be repaired perfectly. The fortress is still standing, but it is no longer whole. Which raises the question Dobo cannot answer honestly to his people. How long can a besieged society survive on discipline alone? Because when the next major assault comes, it will not be a probe. It will be the empire trying to convert attrition into entry by throwing enough bodies at the wall that the defender's capacity finally breaks. And if that happens, the siege doesn't end with a breached wall. It ends with a transfer of ownership over everything inside. The procedure is approaching its decisive step. By early October, Eger is still standing. But it is no longer safe to pretend standing equals strength. The walls hold because they are patched, not because they are intact. The defenders hold because they rotate jobs like components in a machine, not because they feel heroic. And the cruel truth of sieges is this: a fortress can be structurally sound and still doomed if the people inside run out of usable energy. Dobo can see that edge approaching. He doesn't need perfect intelligence. He has the simplest metric. Each day costs him something he cannot replace: powder, sleep, hands. The Ottomans can keep spending. Eger cannot. So, if he wants to survive, he has to attack the one thing the Ottoman method depends on besides force: perception. Because the Ottoman procedure isn't blind. It is a decision-making system driven by observations and reports. How damaged are the walls? How high is enemy morale? How much counterfire do they produce? Do they appear to be receiving reinforcements? How quickly are they repairing breaches? How many sorties are they attempting? How confident do they look at night? An empire doesn't just smash, it measures. And measurement is vulnerable to manipulation. This is where Dobo makes a choice that feels modern, even though it isn't. He wages psychological operations from inside a medieval fortress, not with speeches, with choreography. He has his men move in loops behind torchlight at night, small groups marching along visible paths, disappearing, reappearing, repeating, so that distant observers see motion and interpret it as numbers. Not enough to convince a fool, enough to feed uncertainty in a commander who is already burning campaign time. He orders controlled volleys, timed patterns of cannon and musket fire that make it sound like ammunition is plentiful. Not accurate fire necessarily. Performance fire. The point is not to kill, it is to broadcast capacity. And then he does something that seems irrational in a place of hunger and wounds. He makes the fortress loud, singing, hymns, folk songs, anything that projects the one thing a siege is designed to erase, the feeling of agency. Sound travels across valleys. It leaks into the enemy camp. It says, "We are still organized enough to choose noise." This matters more than people like to admit. The Ottoman method leans heavily on morale breaking before the wall does. Morale is the cheapest breach, so if the defenders appear unbroken, if they appear incredibly stable, then the siege stops being a simple equation. It becomes a question, and questions are dangerous to procedure. On the Ottoman side, those questions are already multiplying. The siege has lasted longer than planned. Men have died in assaults that did not produce entry. Mines have been blunted. The garrison, which should be exhausted, continues to repair and respond. Even an empire can start to feel the weight of an operation that isn't paying out. And the empire's payment schedule is now colliding with climate. Hungarian autumn is not gentle. Days shorten, nights bite, roads soften into mud, supply lines become slower and more fragile. Feeding and maintaining a large army in the field turns from difficult into politically risky. Because the longer an army sits, the more disease, desertion, and disorder creep in. Quietly, like a second siege from inside the camp. This is where philosophy of power gets ugly. We like to talk about domination as strength. But domination is also maintenance. An empire is always managing its own people while it tries to manage others. It must keep its soldiers fed, keep discipline tight, keep confidence high, keep commanders believable. And the most delicate commodity in that management is reputation. A commander can lose men. He can spend powder. He can even fail in a tactical move. But he cannot appear ineffective. Not when his authority depends on the belief that the empire's method works. Not when he has promised results upward. Not when the center expects the frontier to move in one direction. Meanwhile, there's another pressure Dobo understands, and the Ottoman side cannot ignore: the possibility of relief forces. Even if no massive army is about to crash into the siege lines tomorrow, the idea of relief is a strategic poison. It forces the besieger to consider a two-front scenario, trapped between a fortress that won't fall and a field force that might arrive. And in imperial warfare, you don't need certainty for fear to alter behavior. You need plausible risk. So Eger's deception doesn't have to create a real relief army, it only has to create a believable shadow of one. It has to make the Ottoman commanders ask, are we still in control of the timetable? Or is the timetable now controlling us? That is the pivot point of the siege. Because once the attacker loses control of time, the method begins to wobble. Not because the empire becomes weak, but because the empire becomes accountable to winter, to logistics, to the chain of command, to the idea of efficiency. Dobo's goal is not to win by killing, he cannot. His goal is to win by making the siege a bad bargain, to raise the cost of conquest until, inevitable, stops being rational. And it starts to work. The Ottoman camp sees a fortress that should be starving, yet keeps firing in patterns. They hear singing from walls that should be silent. They report movement that could be reinforcements. They watch repairs happen faster than expected. And behind those observations sits a commander who now must decide whether to keep paying for a stubborn place, or to gamble everything on one final decisive assault to justify the time already spent. This is what empires do when procedure stalls. They escalate. They try to convert ambiguity into certainty by spending more force at once. So a date begins to harden into meaning. A final push. A total commitment. A last attempt to force the world back into the empire's preferred story. The story where resistance is punished quickly enough that others learn obedience. Eger senses the change in the air, the way besieged places always do, by the pattern of noise shifting, by the camp outside moving with purpose, by the preparation of ladders and equipment, by the sudden feeling that the attacker is no longer testing. The siege is about to reach its crisis point, where the wall does not just need to hold, but to outlast the method. And if it fails, there will be no second chance, because Eger has no reserves left. The next assault will not be a chapter, it will be an ending. The empire is preparing to spend everything. So is the fortress. There comes a moment in every siege when the attacker stops asking, "Can this be done?" and starts asking, "How do we end this fast enough to make it look inevitable again?" Eger reaches that moment in mid-October when the Ottoman method, so clean on paper, has been delayed long enough to become politically dangerous. The longer the fortress stands, the more it rewrites the story the empire is trying to sell. That resistance is irrational, and surrender is the only adult choice left. So the siege turns decisive. The preparations outside Eger are not subtle. Equipment concentrates. Assault columns mass. Guns are repositioned with the kind of urgency that signals a shift from pressure to finish. Inside the walls, the defenders don't need spies to understand what's coming. They can read the enemy's tempo the way a trapped society learns to read weather, by the pattern of sound, by the density of movement, by the sense that the attacker is no longer experimenting. Dobo gathers what is left of his functional force and does the only honest thing a commander can do at this stage. He narrows the mission. There is no defense in depth when you have no depth. There is no reserve when you have no bodies to reserve. The fortress is now a single line of will stretched across cracked stone and patched earth. Every able hand, soldier and civilian, has already been turned into capacity. Now capacity becomes the front line itself. This is the dark truth of the climax. When stories say they all fought, it sounds inspirational. In reality, it is what happens when a system has consumed its margins. The siege has burned away the distance between combatant and non-combatant, not because the defenders are romantic, but because the empire has forced the choice: function as a whole or be taken piece by piece. The morning of the decisive assault begins the way method begins, with coordinated bombardment, not scattered harassment, but a concentrated attempt to make repair impossible. This is artillery used as synchronization. Pin the defenders, disrupt movement, create dust and panic, and then stop firing at the exact moment the assault columns step forward, so the silence itself becomes a weapon. The defenders hear the firing cease and feel that dread in their bodies. This is where the ladders come. This is where the mines have softened something. This is where the wall stops being a structure and becomes a test. When the Ottoman troops surge, they come from multiple points at once, because the Empire has learned the fortress's trick. You can funnel attackers at one wall and kill them efficiently. So now the Empire tries to widen the funnel until the defenders can't cover it. The defenders respond with the only advantage they still possess: familiarity. They know every angle, every choke point, every place a ladder can realistically bite stone. They hold fire until distance collapses. They spend ammunition. Like a dying economy spends its last currency, only where it counts. And it counts. Grape shot and musket volleys tear into packed bodies. Ladders slam against parapets. Men climb into the narrow geometry where numbers can't fully express themselves. The wall becomes a brutal sorting mechanism. Only so many can crest at once. Only so many can fight at the top. Only so many can be pushed back before the next hands appear. Then the worst case happens. Because in a siege, the worst case always happens somewhere. Breaches open. Not necessarily the clean cinematic hole people expect, but the kind of compromised section where masonry has been weakened, where packed earth is exposed, where a rush of bodies can force entry, if the defenders hesitate for even a minute. And in that minute, the siege changes shape. Once attackers are inside an outer court, the wall is no longer purely protection. It becomes confinement with enemies now sharing the same enclosure. What follows is not heroic choreography. It is emergency governance under impact. Barricades thrown together from rubble, timber, furniture, anything that turns open space into a new choke point. Defenders redirecting themselves like water flowing to the leak. Civilians carrying stones and water and ammunition because those are now literal life support systems. A besieged fortress in its final hours does not operate like an army. It operates like a burning building where everyone understands the stairs are gone. Dobo is forced into the kind of leadership that reveals the philosophy of power in the ugliest way. There is no grand strategy left. Only the ability to keep people believing their actions still matter. He moves to the most threatened point, because the appearance of command is itself a weapon. Not a theatrical weapon, a psychological one. When the defenders see their commander where the wall is failing, it tells them the system of defense still exists. It tells them there is still a center. And in a siege, the loss of center is death. Hours pass in a blur of impact and proximity. The attackers push, are repulsed, push again. The defenders fall, are replaced, fall again. And somewhere in that repetition, the Ottoman method meets a limit it is designed to avoid: fatigue without payoff. Assault doctrine assumes casualties. It does not assume stagnation. It assumes that if enough bodies are thrown at the breach, the defenders will break first. But Eger's defenders, stripped of everything except the refusal to cooperate, keep filling the gap. This is not because they are morally superior. It is because the alternative is not abstract. The alternative is ownership over their homes, their labor, their bodies, their ability to remain themselves in the story that comes after the gate opens. Sieges create a situation where the future is so threatening that the present becomes bearable. That is the trap. That is the engine. By late in the day, something shifts. Not a miracle, an exhaustion curve. The attacker's coordination softens. Officers strain to keep formation. The men who climb now climb slower. The breaches are still contested. The fortress, impossibly, is still not fully taken. The defenders, barely human with fatigue, realize they are no longer fighting momentum. They are fighting persistence. And then, the most unnerving sound of all arrives. Silence. Not victory silence. Not celebration. Just the sudden reduction of pressure. The sense that the assault is being called off to regroup, to breathe, to decide what comes next. For the defenders, that silence is not Hukaf. It's a question hanging in the air like smoke. Is this pause the beginning of the end, or only the breath before the empire tries again? Because if the Ottomans return tomorrow with the same commitment, Eger has nothing left to spend. And that is the cliff at the heart of the siege. The fortress has survived the day the system should have won. But survival is not the same as escape. Night falls on a ruin that is still standing. And somewhere outside the walls, an imperial commander has to decide whether to keep paying for this argument. The night after the decisive assault is not a celebration inside Eger. It is inventory taken over the dead. How many are still able to stand on a wall? How many matchlocks can still fire without breaking? How many barrels of powder remain that aren't damp, spilled, or already committed to the next emergency? How many wounds have turned red and hot in a way that means infection is already writing tomorrow's death list? In a siege, victory doesn't arrive as joy. It arrives as the temporary absence of the next catastrophe. Outside the walls, the Ottoman camp has its own inventory, and it is colder than any heroic story wants to admit. Men killed, men wounded, specialists exhausted, ammunition spent, days burned. A siege that was supposed to be procedure has become friction. This is where people misunderstand empire. They imagine an empire as infinite willpower, but empires are not infinite. They are bureaucracies with supply problems. They are hierarchies with reputations. They are machines that need to justify their costs to themselves, because an institution that cannot justify its violence eventually loses the discipline that makes it effective. Eger forces that justification into the open. Even if the Ottoman state can absorb heavy losses numerically, it cannot ignore what those losses mean politically. Elite troops and trained specialists are not interchangeable with peasant levies. They represent time invested, training cycles, internal order. A prolonged, costly siege against a fortress that should have fallen faster creates a question that spreads upward. Why are we spending so much to receive so little? And in imperial politics, receiving little isn't defined only by land gained. It is defined by narrative control. The empire is supposed to look inevitable. Eger has made it look stalled. Then there is the most merciless variable of all, season. As October advances, the Hungarian highlands do what they always do. Nights grow harsher, roads degrade. The cost of moving anything, food, powder, wounded men, rises. Campaigning becomes a logistical gamble, and an army that gambles with logistics, gambles with discipline. Hunger in a camp does not produce noble suffering. It produces theft, unrest, sickness, desertion, and the slow corrosion of command. The Ottoman commanders also face strategic uncertainty. A relief force does not have to be present to be dangerous. It only has to be plausible. Rumors of troop movements, scattered clashes with patrols, the possibility of being caught between a fortress that still refuses to die and a field army approaching from behind. This is enough to poison the siege. Because the siege's entire logic depends on control. Control of routes, control of information, control of time. If there's even a chance that control is about to be contested, the procedure begins to look reckless. And now the cruel twist. The defender's deception becomes real in its effect, even if it was never real in its substance. The fortress has manipulated perception long enough that the besiegers can no longer trust their own assumptions. Is Eger receiving help? Are the defenders truly as depleted as they should be? Are they holding only by a thread, or by a hidden reserve? In war, commanders don't make decisions based on truth. They make decisions based on what they can afford to risk being wrong about. Eger has raised the price of being wrong. So the Ottoman leadership faces a choice that is less dramatic than it is consequential. Double down or withdraw. Double down means more assaults, more powder, more time, more risk of winter swallowing the army's momentum. Withdraw means humiliation, the visible admission that a small fortress has forced the empire to stop. This is the moment where the big question returns in a sharper form. If siege warfare is designed to manufacture surrender, if the entire method is built to make resistance feel childish, what does it mean when resistance outlasts the method's timetable? It means the empire's power, while vast, is not purely material. It is psychological. It depends on the target believing the empire can afford endless pressure. Eger's survival has punctured that belief. Not permanently, not universally, but enough to matter. When the withdrawal begins, it does not look like defeat in the way stories imagine. It looks like logistics. Tents struck, equipment loaded, siege works dismantled, columns forming. The empire does not run. It organizes departure the way it organizes arrival, because organization is how it preserves authority even in retreat. But the meaning is undeniable. The siege is being lifted. The method is being paused. Inside Eger, the silence is nearly unbearable. A besieged society has been living inside noise for weeks. Cannon, drums, shouts, the crack of matchlocks, the dull thud of impacts. Even in quiet moments, people listen for the next sound, because the next sound decides whether you live. So when the sound stops, the nervous system doesn't relax. It panics. Many defenders do not cheer. They sit, they stare, they weep, not from triumph, but from the sudden release of tension that has been holding their bodies together. This is the aftermath of nobody likes to film, the unheroic accounting, the wounded who will die anyway, the burned hands that will never fully heal, the walls that will need years of reconstruction, the fields outside that have been trampled into mud, the homes burned in the villages that fled into the fortress and now have nowhere to return to. The siege ends, but the cost continues. And yet, in political terms, the meaning travels fast. News spreads across Central Europe that a fortress has held, that a campaign has been stalled, that an empire has paid a price and received no immediate trophy to show for it. The inevitability narrative takes a wound, and on frontiers, narratives are weapons. A town that believes resistance is possible behaves differently than a town that believes surrender is the only adult option. This is why Eger matters. Not because it ends the Ottoman-Habsburg struggle. It doesn't. Not because it permanently stops Ottoman power. It won't. But because it exposes the limits of procedure. It shows that even a highly developed conquest machine can be forced into a bad bargain when the target refuses to cooperate with the psychological timetable. And now the final question hangs over the survivors inside Eger. If they have survived by turning themselves into a machine, by rationing, coercing routine, weaponizing their household, and accepting horrors as necessary, what exactly have they preserved? Freedom? Or just the right to keep paying the bill themselves? The answer is not sentimental. It is historical, and it waits in what happens next. How the story is told, who owns it, and what the frontier does with the myth. Because the ledger doesn't close when the army leaves. It closes when memory decides what counted as victory. When the Ottoman camp finally disappears from the valley, the temptation is to call Eger a victory and stop thinking. A small garrison held against overwhelming force. A heroic commander. Civilians who refused to kneel. The kind of story nations build monuments for. But if you want the truth, you have to look at what a siege actually produces. A siege doesn't just attack walls. It reorganizes a society, its labor, its hunger, its morality, until the only remaining choice is endurance. Eger survives, yes, but it survives as a battered organism that has spent its future to purchase a present. This brings us back to the big question we began with. When an empire turns siege warfare into procedure, what is it really buying? Territory, or the human reflex to surrender? And who pays the bill? The answer is, the empire is buying predictability. It is trying to turn human fear into a reliable output. Not because the Ottoman state is uniquely evil, but because this is what large power does when it wants stability on a frontier. It converts violence into routine so that the next town surrenders without requiring an expensive fight. That is the psychology of empire. It doesn't need every fortress to fall. It needs most fortresses to believe falling is inevitable. And Eger broke that spell temporarily by changing the price. Dobo didn't defeat the Ottoman state on the field. He made the siege a bad bargain. He and the people inside forced the empire to keep paying in elite manpower, ammunition, and, most dangerously, campaign time. They made the procedure stall long enough that winter, supply constraints, uncertainty about relief forces, and reputational risk began to outweigh the value of finishing the operation. Eger's resistance did not destroy the machine. It caused the machine to calculate and withdraw. So who paid the bill? Everyone inside. They paid in dead and wounded that could not be replaced, in burned hands and infected cuts, in children turned into runners and laborers because there weren't enough soldiers left to carry what needed carrying, in a fortress turned into a rationing state where hunger became law and routine became coercion. That is the cost of refusing to surrender on schedule. You must build your own internal discipline hard enough to survive the empire's discipline. And who profited? In the short term, no one profits in a moral sense. But in political terms, states profit from narratives. Hungary and the Habsburg world gained something rare in the 16th century: proof that the Ottoman procedure could be resisted. Not forever, not everywhere, but enough to alter behavior on the frontier. A fortress that holds becomes a contagious idea. It stiffens other garrisons. It buys time for other defenses. It makes surrender less automatic. This is why the story spread so quickly across Europe after 1552. It isn't just entertainment, it's strategic morale. It is propaganda in the oldest sense, an argument intended to shape future decisions. The defenders of Eger become symbols because symbols are cheaper than armies, and sometimes more effective. A story can hold a border when money can't. But history is not a morality play, and legacy is never stable. This is the part national myths like to skip. Eger does not become permanently invincible. The Ottoman-Habsburg struggle continues for generations, and Eger itself is eventually taken in 1596, decades later, during the long grind of frontier warfare. That doesn't erase 1552. It clarifies it. A single siege is not a permanent shield. It is a moment in a wider system where both sides learn, adapt, and return. The individuals are also not protected by the legend. Survivors carry trauma that chroniclers translate into piety, but we can recognize as psychological injury. Nightmares, startle responses, numbness, the inability to return to ordinary life after living inside a month of controlled terror. The siege ends, but the mind doesn't lift the siege so quickly. And then comes the final, uncomfortable truth. Even the act of remembering is a kind of power. Who gets named? Commanders. Who gets blurred? The anonymous hands that carried water, hauled rubble, tended wounds, died in courtyards without having their lives recorded as anything but numbers. Chronicles and later retellings often elevate a few figures and flatten the rest into the people. That flattening is itself a second conquest, this time of memory. It turns real suffering into a usable symbol. So Eger's legacy becomes a battlefield of its own. In later centuries, Hungarians will invoke Eger as proof of national endurance. Writers will mythologize it. Visitors will walk the restored walls and imagine the siege as a clean story of courage. And that's not wrong. It's incomplete. Because what Eger truly demonstrates is not that humans are magically brave. It demonstrates that power, imperial power, works by making submission feel like the only rational option, and that sometimes the only way to resist is to refuse the psychology of inevitability long enough to force the empire into a worse calculation. Eger held because the defenders refused to cooperate with the timetable. That is the philosophical core, not that they were pure, not that they were untouched, but that they broke the machine's predictability by paying a price the machine expected them to avoid. And that's the final irony. The empire tried to purchase surrender with fear. Eger purchased survival with discipline. Both were systems. Both were costly. The difference is who got to decide when the contract ended. So when people ask, would you have stayed? They are asking the wrong question. The real question is, when power arrives as procedure, when violence is organized into routine, how much of your humanity will you spend just to keep the right to say no? Because when the ledger closes, the bones don't tell a heroic story. They tell a balanced one.